On a bone-chilling winter evening in the heart of Milwood, a small, close-knit town where everyone knew everyone else's business, whispers started circulating. People noticed Rachel Dunn, a single mother known for her quiet resilience, clutching her feverish young son Eli close to her chest as she hurried down the town's main street. Eli's small body was wrapped in Rachel's thin, worn-out coat, his pale face buried against her shoulder as he whimpered softly. She was rushing toward the diner where she worked, barely making enough to scrape by, hoping to find some assistance or even a temporary refuge from the icy cold. The scene of Rachel hurrying through town with her sick child caught the attention of curious onlookers, some peeking through the frosted windows of shops or stopping mid-conversation to watch her pass. But despite the stares, no one offered a hand, a blanket, or even a sympathetic word. Rachel's story was one of quiet endurance and backbreaking work, the kind of life that Milwood rarely paid attention to. Once, she had dreams, ambitions of becoming a nurse and making a real difference in the world. But after her partner abandoned her shortly after Eli's birth, her dreams were cast aside as she took on whatever work she could find to support her son. Rachel's daily routine involved long hours at the local diner, scrubbing dishes and mopping floors until her hands were raw and cracked. Her pay barely covered the rent for the tiny, run-down apartment they lived in, owned by none other than Mr. Arthur Barrett, a man whose name was whispered around town with a mixture of fear and disdain. Arthur Barrett was Milwood's notorious landlord, known for his hard-nosed, profit-driven approach. He controlled much of the town's rental properties, charging exorbitant rent and showing no mercy to tenants who fell behind. His tall, gaunt figure and piercing gaze had become symbols of his reputation, and he wielded his power mercilessly. To him, tenants were numbers, mere dollar signs to be added or crossed off his books. Rachel had always managed to stay out of Mr. Barrett's way. Knowing that the slightest slip could lead to trouble, she scrimped, saved, and sacrificed endlessly to keep a roof over her son's head, but even her iron will and careful budgeting couldn't shield her from life's inevitable misfortunes. The breaking point came one particularly harsh winter month. Eli's health, always fragile due to a chronic respiratory condition, took a sharp downturn. Rachel spent every dollar she could on doctor's visits and medication, rationing food and skipping meals to keep her son alive. She convinced herself that things would improve, that maybe, just maybe, she'd make it to the end of the month without incident. But despite her best efforts, she fell behind on rent, a fact she tried to keep from Eli, as she reassured him each night with soft lullabies, stroking his hair as he lay feverish beside her. She told him everything would be okay, that they'd get through it together. But deep down, Rachel was drowning in fear. Then, as if the universe wanted to test her resilience further, Rachel returned from work one evening to find a stark white eviction notice pinned to her door, signed by Arthur Barrett himself. The notice gave her exactly 1 week to vacate the apartment. 1 week. Her hands trembled as she read the words, her heart pounding with a mix of fury and helplessness. How could anyone be so heartless? She knew Barrett's reputation. But this, evicting a mother with a sick child in the dead of winter, felt like an act of pure cruelty. Rachel's first instinct was to run to Barrett's office, to beg him for more time, to explain Eli's condition and plead for mercy. But she quickly squashed the thought, knowing from whispers around town that Barrett didn't care about excuses. To him, tenants either paid or they left. End of story. Rachel's mind raced as she tried to think of a solution. She sought help from local charities and even approached some of her neighbors, but her pleas were met with sympathetic shrugs and averted gazes. Milwood was a town that often turned its back on those in need, afraid of crossing the lines of power drawn by people like Barrett. Some neighbors offered quiet condolences, murmuring that they wished they could help but couldn't risk their own situations. Others, however, looked down their noses, quick to cast judgment on her irresponsibility for not managing her money better. The rejection stung, each dismissal a reminder that, in the eyes of her community, she was alone. With no other options, Rachel began packing what few belongings she had, her heart aching as she tucked away Eli's toys, his favorite blanket, and the small collection of books she read to him each night. In the dead of night, she carried her son and their bags down to an old, unused trailer parked on the outskirts of town, a temporary shelter offered by Mrs. Dawes, a former tenant of Barrett's who had her own scars from dealing with him. Mrs. Dawes warned Rachel that the trailer's heater was faulty, but it was better than the streets, and Rachel had little choice. She bundled Eli in layers of blankets, lying beside him as the biting cold seeped through the walls, praying he would make it through the night. The next few days were a blur of hardship. Rachel took on odd jobs, cleaning houses, and working short shifts wherever she could find work, but even these meager earnings barely covered food and medicine. She did everything in her power to keep Eli warm and safe, even as she grew weaker from exhaustion and hunger. On one particularly bitter evening, as snowflakes drifted down like silent witnesses to her suffering, she reached a point of desperation. Her son's fever had spiked, and his breathing became labored. Rachel knew she couldn't wait any longer. She needed medical help, and she needed it fast. In a final act of desperation, she returned to town, her feet numb from the cold, and headed straight for Barrett's office. She was done with pride. All she wanted was one more chance to save her son. Standing in the small, dimly lit office, she looked Barrett in the eyes, her voice breaking as she begged him to reconsider the eviction, to give her and Eli just a little more time. But Barrett's expression was as cold and unyielding as the winter night outside. He listened in silence, his face a mask of indifference, before finally replying with a dismissive wave of his hand. "It's not my problem," he said flatly, his voice devoid of any empathy. "If you can't pay, you can't stay. That's the way it is." Rachel stood there, shattered, as the last remnants of hope drained from her. She walked out of his office, a heavy silence settling over her, and returned to Eli, who was lying feverish in the trailer. She cradled him close, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep, but vows nonetheless. In that moment, with her son's life hanging in the balance, Rachel made a silent, unbreakable vow to herself. They would survive this, not only for themselves but to prove to everyone, including Arthur Barrett, that they were stronger than anyone believed. As she huddled beside her son in the dark, Rachel's mind burned with a fierce determination. She would not be broken by Barrett's cruelty. She would rise from this, somehow, and ensure that one day the tables would turn. Rachel's resolve was fierce, but determination alone couldn't keep Eli warm. Each day was a test of endurance as she tried to shield her son from the biting cold and their bleak reality. The trailer Mrs. Dawes had loaned her was as old as it was fragile, with cracks in the walls that let in icy drafts, and a barely functioning heater that clattered to life only sporadically. Rachel used every resource at her disposal, from old blankets to thick layers of clothing, to keep Eli warm, but it wasn't enough. His cough worsened, rattling through the night like a harbinger of despair, and his once bright eyes grew dull with exhaustion. Rachel's days became a whirlwind of small, desperate efforts to find money. She found odd jobs wherever she could, a few hours cleaning houses, a brief shift at a nearby gas station, even helping load deliveries at the local grocery store. It wasn't enough, but every dollar counted. Her hands grew red and rough from the cold and constant work, and her body ached with fatigue, but she pushed herself beyond her limits, driven by the knowledge that Eli depended on her. She rarely slept, keeping vigil over her son through the night, hoping that somehow they would make it through this ordeal. Despite her relentless efforts, the town's response remained painfully indifferent. Some locals cast her sympathetic glances, murmuring pity under their breath as they watched her struggle. But pity didn't pay for medicine or food, and none were willing to intervene. The town of Milwood had grown accustomed to Mr. Barrett's iron-fisted control, and fear of crossing him kept everyone silent. Rachel became an unspoken example, a reminder of what could happen if one fell afoul of the town's most powerful man. She overheard whispers as she walked down the street, fragments of gossip that only fueled her isolation. She should have known better. Some would say, people need to live within their means. Rachel absorbed each harsh comment in silence, her heart growing harder with every passing day. She had no time to feel the sting of judgment. Her every waking moment was spent trying to survive, to keep her son alive. One cold evening, she was returning to the trailer after a long day of scrubbing floors, her back aching, when she ran into Mrs. Dawes. The elderly woman, a frail figure wrapped in layers of mismatched scarves and jackets, had come to check on her, carrying a bag of canned food and a worn thermos of hot soup. Rachel's eyes filled with tears of gratitude as she accepted the gift, grateful for this single act of kindness in a world that had turned its back on her. "You know, dear," Mrs. Dawes whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind, "Barrett did this to me too, years ago. Kicked me out when I couldn't pay after my husband died. He doesn't care about anyone, just his precious profits." Her words held a bitterness that resonated deeply with Rachel. She wasn't alone in her suffering. There were others who had been crushed by Barrett's greed. But instead of comforting her, this realization only intensified her determination. If she ever got the chance, she vowed silently, she would make sure no one else would have to suffer under Barrett's thumb. The nights in the trailer grew colder as a particularly brutal storm hit Milwood. Snow piled against the trailer's fragile door, and Rachel used every piece of fabric she could find to insulate the walls. She wrapped Eli in layers and held him close, praying he would stay warm enough through the night. His cough had worsened, each ragged breath breaking her heart a little more. Desperation clawed at her mind, and she found herself wondering if she would ever escape this relentless nightmare. She thought about the times she had come so close to giving up, to admitting defeat, but something inside her refused to surrender. Then, one freezing morning, Eli's condition took a terrifying turn. He lay pale and listless, his breathing shallow and his forehead burning with fever. Rachel's heart pounded as she realized she couldn't wait any longer. She had to get him to the hospital, no matter the cost. She bundled him up as best as she could, wrapping him in blankets and cradling him close to her chest as she hurried through the snow. Each step was a struggle, her legs numb and her breath coming in short gasps. But she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that her son's life hung in the balance. The hospital staff were sympathetic but firm. Without insurance or funds, they could offer only limited care. Rachel's pleas fell on deaf ears, her desperation dismissed with bureaucratic coldness. She held Eli's hand as they sat in the waiting room, her mind racing with fear and anger. She felt as though she were trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by people who could help but chose not to. She saw the judgment in their eyes, the silent accusations that she had failed as a mother. The weight of it crushed her, filling her with a despair so deep it seemed impossible to escape. As she sat there, defeated and exhausted, a memory surfaced, a memory of Mr. Barrett, standing in his warm, opulent office as he dismissed her pleas with a wave of his hand. The image filled her with a renewed fury, a raw, seething anger that cut through her despair. She realized then that she couldn't rely on anyone else to save them. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to keep Eli alive, she would have to fight with everything she had. This was a battle she couldn't afford to lose. That evening, after returning to the trailer with Eli, Rachel made a decision. She would not let Barrett win. She would find a way to pull herself out of this, to build a life for herself and her son, even if it meant leaving Milwood behind. She would work, she would scrape and save, and one day she would rise above the life Barrett had tried to trap her in. She began planning her escape from Milwood, sketching out a future that was hazy and uncertain but filled with hope. She would save every dollar, take on every job, do whatever it took to leave this town and its toxic power dynamics behind. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As she worked tirelessly over the next few weeks, juggling multiple jobs and caring for Eli, a series of unexpected events began to unfold. People in the town started to take notice of her resilience, her refusal to give in despite the insurmountable odds stacked against her. Whispers spread about the mother and son struggling to survive in an old trailer on the edge of town, and slowly a handful of townsfolk began to come forward with small acts of kindness. One neighbor left a bag of groceries by her door, while another dropped off a pile of firewood without saying a word. These gestures were small, but to Rachel, they were monumental, a reminder that there was still compassion in the world. Yet, the community's support was not enough to protect her from the harsh realities of Milwood. Mr. Barrett continued to rule the town with an iron fist, his influence casting a shadow over Rachel's every step. But Rachel clung to her resolve, fueled by the knowledge that she would one day leave this place behind. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, that she would face obstacles and hardships beyond anything she had experienced before, but she was ready. For Eli, for herself, for every person who had been crushed by Barrett's greed, she would rise. And when that day came, when she had built a life free from his control, she would look back on this chapter of her life not with bitterness, but with pride, because she would have won. And Barrett would be nothing more than a memory, a chapter she had overcome. Rachel's journey had only just begun, but as she lay beside Eli that night, watching his peaceful face as he finally slept without coughing, she knew one thing for certain. She would fight, she would survive, and one day she would thrive. And no one, not even Arthur Barrett, could take that away from her. The days passed in a blur of endless work and worry for Rachel, her life split between caring for Eli and fighting for their survival. The cold, damp air in the trailer seemed to seep into her bones, a constant reminder of how precarious their situation was. Yet, with every passing day, Rachel's resolve only strengthened. She had become an unstoppable force, taking on every odd job she could find, no matter how exhausting, all to save enough for the day she could finally leave Milwood and give Eli the life he deserved. Her hands grew rough and calloused, her body ached from the relentless labor, but she pushed herself beyond her limits, fueled by her love for her son and the unbreakable promise she had made to herself. Then, one bitterly cold morning, as Rachel was returning from a grueling night shift at the gas station, she noticed a familiar figure standing outside the trailer. It was Mrs. Dawes, bundled in her usual layers, but this time her face was lined with worry. Rachel's heart sank as she quickened her pace, fearing something had happened to Eli. But as she drew closer, Mrs. Dawes pulled her aside and spoke in a low, urgent voice. "I don't want to alarm you, Rachel," she began, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "But I've been hearing things about Barrett. Rumor has it he's planning to sell off a bunch of properties, including this trailer lot. He's in some kind of financial trouble, and he's desperate for cash. If he sells, he might force everyone here out without any notice." Rachel's blood ran cold. It felt like every time she managed to find a fragile sense of stability, fate conspired to rip it away. Losing even this dilapidated trailer would mean they'd have nowhere to go, and with winter worsening, the consequences could be deadly for Eli. She clenched her fists, her mind racing as she tried to process this new threat. She had no savings, no other options, and she was all too aware that Barrett would show her no mercy if he saw a way to profit off her misfortune. A deep sense of dread settled over Rachel, but she refused to let it crush her. Instead, it fueled a burning rage, a fire that had been smoldering ever since Barrett had left her and Eli to freeze in the streets. She had endured more than she thought possible, and she had done it alone, with no help from anyone. But this was different. This was her breaking point. She couldn't just accept Barrett's cruelty anymore. She had to fight back, not only for herself and Eli, but for every person who had suffered under Barrett's rule. A spark of defiance flared within her, and for the first time, Rachel allowed herself to consider a bold, dangerous thought. She would confront Barrett once and for all. That afternoon, Rachel left Eli with Mrs. Dawes, who had offered to watch over him. She knew her son was in good hands, but the thought of leaving him, even for a short while, filled her with anxiety. But this was something she had to do, and she steeled herself as she made her way to Barrett's office, her mind sharp with determination. She had no plan, no script, only the raw anger and desperation that had been building within her for months. Barrett's office was a small, unassuming building nestled among the main row of shops, a modest front that belied the man's wealth and influence. As she approached, she could feel the weight of the town's stares, people watching from behind frosty windows, whispering as she passed. It didn't matter to her now. She was beyond shame or fear of judgment. All she cared about was Eli and the promise she had made to protect him at all costs. Inside, the office was as cold and unwelcoming as its owner. The dull gray carpet stretched across the floor, and the walls were lined with outdated paperwork and filing cabinets. Behind a cluttered desk sat Arthur Barrett himself, his eyes narrowing as he looked up and recognized Rachel. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth as if he'd been expecting her. "Well, if it isn't Miss Dunn," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "What brings you here? Surely you're not here to beg again." Rachel bit back her anger, refusing to rise to his bait. She took a steadying breath, her gaze unwavering as she met his cold, calculating eyes. "I'm not here to beg, Mr. Barrett. I'm here to ask for one last chance. Eli is sick, and we have nowhere else to go. All I'm asking for is time. Just a little more time until I can find another place." Barrett's smirk widened, and he leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he regarded her with a look of amusement. "Time. Time costs money, Miss Dunn, and from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look like you have much of that." He let out a low chuckle, his gaze drifting dismissively over her worn clothes and tired face. "Why should I make an exception for you?" A surge of fury rose within Rachel, and for the first time, she didn't try to hide it. "Because you have a responsibility to this town. You can't keep treating people like they're disposable. Eli is just a child. He doesn't deserve to suffer because of your greed." Barrett's expression darkened, the amusement fading as he narrowed his eyes. "Let me make something clear, Miss Dunn," he said coldly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know you or anyone else in this town. A damn thing. If you can't pay, you're out. That's how the world works. The sooner you accept that, the better." Rachel's hands trembled with rage, but she held her ground, refusing to let him see her break. "One day, Mr. Barrett," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fury coursing through her. "One day, you'll pay for the way you've treated people. And when that day comes, I hope you remember every single person you turned your back on." Barrett scoffed, dismissing her words with a wave of his hand. "Get out," he said coldly, "and don't come back unless you have the money." Rachel turned on her heel, her heart pounding as she stormed out of the office. She could feel the tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Barrett the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She left his office with her head held high, determined to find a way out of this nightmare, no matter what it took. Back at the trailer, Rachel found Mrs. Dawes waiting with Eli, who was asleep under a pile of blankets, his breathing shallow but steady. Mrs. Dawes looked up as Rachel entered, her eyes filled with concern. Did he help?" she asked hesitantly. Rachel shook her head, her expression hardened with resolve. "No, but it doesn't matter. We're going to get out of here, one way or another. I'm done letting that man control our lives." Over the next few weeks, Rachel threw herself into her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She saved every penny, scrimping and saving until she had enough to buy a bus ticket out of town. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She refused to let Barrett win. She was going to build a life for herself and Eli, somewhere far from Milwood and its dark memories. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was done being a victim. As she prepared to leave Milwood behind, a strange twist of fate intervened. One evening, as she was working late at the gas station, she overheard a conversation between two customers. They were talking about Barrett, about how he'd overextended himself financially, taking on risky investments that were starting to fall apart. Rumor had it that he was in trouble, that he'd lost most of his fortune in a series of bad deals. The thought filled Rachel with a grim satisfaction. For the first time, it seemed that Barrett's greed had come back to haunt him. The news spread quickly, and soon the whole town was buzzing with whispers about Barrett's downfall. Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice as she watched his empire crumble. The man who had caused so much suffering was finally facing his own reckoning. It was as if fate had intervened, granting her a measure of justice she had never expected. As she boarded the bus with Eli by her side, Rachel took one last look at the town that had been the source of so much pain and hardship. She felt a sense of closure, a weight lifting from her shoulders as she left Milwood behind. She had survived, against all odds, and she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. Because she had something no one could take from her, a fierce, unbreakable spirit, forged in the fires of hardship. And as the bus pulled away, leaving Milwood in the distance, Rachel allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. She had won. She had overcome everything Barrett had thrown at her, and she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. And somewhere, deep in her heart, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where she and Eli would finally have the life they deserved, free from the shadows of the past. Rachel's life after Milwood was an exercise in resilience and rebirth. She had escaped Barrett's cold grip, but the struggles were far from over. Arriving in a new town with nothing but a few bags and a modest amount of cash, she faced the daunting task of rebuilding her life from scratch. Every day was a new test, filled with uncertainty, yet Rachel held her head high. For the first time in years, she felt a strange, exhilarating freedom, a freedom she had never known under Barrett's shadow. It was as if leaving Milwood had lifted an invisible weight from her shoulders, allowing her to breathe deeply and think of the future without fear. The new town, called Brook Haven, was a place of modest charm with a close-knit community much like Milwood, though it lacked the oppressive influence of any one person or landlord. The residents seemed more welcoming, and Rachel found herself daring to hope that they might be more compassionate than those she'd known before. Determined to make a fresh start, she immediately began searching for work. The first few days were rough. Every door she knocked on seemed to close before she even got a chance to explain herself. Many places were wary of hiring a single mother with limited resources and a child in tow. But Rachel persisted, driven by an unshakable resolve to provide Eli with a stable life. Her break finally came when she met Clara Thompson, the owner of a small cleaning service. Clara, a warm-hearted woman with a tough exterior, listened to Rachel's story with quiet empathy. She had come from humble beginnings herself and understood what it meant to struggle. Impressed by Rachel's determination and resilience, Clara offered her a job with flexible hours, allowing Rachel to care for Eli while still earning an income. The pay wasn't high, but it was enough to start piecing together the fragments of their new life. Rachel threw herself into her work with the same intensity she had back in Milwood, grateful for every hour of labor that brought her closer to stability. She worked long hours, often scrubbing floors and washing windows until her fingers ached, but there was a difference now. Here in Brook Haven, her hard work was met with appreciation rather than disdain. Clara's clients were kind, often leaving her small tips or offering her a warm drink on cold days. Slowly, Rachel began to feel a part of the community, her spirits lifting with each small gesture of kindness. But life had another twist in store. One afternoon, as Rachel was finishing a cleaning job at a local office, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. Two women were chatting near the front desk, discussing the recent news from Milwood. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she caught the name Arthur Barrett, spoken in hushed, scandalized tones. She stopped, barely daring to breathe, as she listened to their words. "Can you believe it? Arthur Barrett, the big-shot landlord, went bankrupt, lost everything in some bad investments," one of the women whispered. The other woman shook her head, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Serves him right. I heard he treated his tenants horribly, throwing people out on the streets without a second thought." Now he's the one begging for mercy. Rachel's mind reeled. The image of Barrett, the man who had once wielded so much power, who had evicted her and her sick son without a shred of compassion, now reduced to a state of desperation, was almost surreal. She could hardly believe it, yet the sense of justice that flooded through her was undeniable. A part of her felt vindicated, as if the universe had finally balanced the scales. Barrett's greed and arrogance had been his undoing, and now he was reaping the consequences of his cruelty. The news spread quickly through Brook Haven, and before long, it seemed like everyone had heard about the fall of Arthur Barrett. His empire, once so unassailable, had crumbled overnight, leaving him stripped of his wealth and reputation. Rachel learned from further conversations that he had not only lost his properties but was now deeply in debt, facing legal troubles from numerous former tenants who had banded together to file a lawsuit against him for unfair treatment and unlawful evictions. Barrett's name became synonymous with ruin and disgrace, a cautionary tale of what happened when greed overpowered humanity. The encounter with Barrett left Rachel with an unexpected sense of peace, a feeling of closure she hadn't realized she needed. For years, she had carried the weight of his actions, the bitterness that had fueled her resolve to survive, and the haunting memories of that brutal winter in Milwood. But now, standing on the other side of his downfall, she saw that she had risen above it all, not because of him, but because of her own strength. The meeting had illuminated something vital within her, a realization that she was no longer defined by what she had endured. She was more than her past, more than the hardships she'd faced. The days turned into weeks, and Rachel found herself adjusting to a new normal. She continued working for Clara's cleaning service, but her responsibilities had grown. Clara, seeing Rachel's diligence and leadership skills, had recently promoted her to a supervisory role. Rachel now managed a small team, coordinating schedules, training new hires, and even handling some of the company's finances. It was more responsibility than she had ever had before, but she embraced it with enthusiasm. Each day she woke up early, taking Eli to his new school, where he was thriving among supportive teachers and friends, then diving into her work with a passion and purpose she had only dreamed of back in Milwood. One evening, as she was settling in at home after a long day, Rachel received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was warm and friendly, introducing herself as Sarah Linton, the director of a local community organization that provided housing assistance, job training, and resources to families in need. Sarah explained that Clara had recommended Rachel as someone who might be interested in helping with a new project the organization was launching, a program aimed at empowering single mothers through mentorship and skills training. The organization wanted Rachel to be a mentor, to share her story, and to guide other women who were struggling to rebuild their lives. At first, Rachel was hesitant. She had spent so much of her life trying to escape her past that the thought of reliving it felt daunting. But Sarah's words stayed with her. She knew what it was like to feel alone, to have no one to lean on, and the thought of helping others through that darkness struck a deep chord within her. After a long night of consideration, Rachel called Sarah back the next day, agreeing to join the project as a mentor. Her involvement with the organization quickly became one of the most fulfilling experiences of her life. She met women from all walks of life, each with their own stories of hardship and resilience, and each determined to overcome their struggles just as she had. Rachel's role was to listen, to guide, and to support these women, offering advice and encouragement drawn from her own experiences. She shared the raw, unfiltered truth of what she had gone through in Milwood. And while the memories were painful, sharing them allowed her to process her journey in a way that was healing. She watched as the women found strength in her story, as they saw in her a reflection of their own potential for growth and change. One woman in particular, Maria, reminded Rachel of herself. Maria was a single mother who had escaped an abusive relationship, arriving in Brook Haven with her 2 young daughters and little else. She was scared, uncertain, and overwhelmed, yet she had a fierce determination in her eyes that Rachel recognized instantly. Week after week, Rachel worked with Maria, teaching her budgeting skills, helping her apply for jobs, and supporting her as she searched for stable housing. Slowly, Rachel watched Maria transform from a timid, broken woman into a confident, capable mother, filled with hope and determination for her family's future. Seeing Maria's progress was like watching a mirror of her own journey, and it filled Rachel with a pride and joy that no amount of money or success could replace. As her role in the organization grew, Rachel began to make connections throughout Brook Haven. She was no longer just the new girl or a cleaning supervisor. People came to know her as a community leader, a woman who had overcome incredible odds and was now using her experience to lift others. Her reputation spread, and soon, people began reaching out to her with offers and opportunities she had never imagined. Local businesses invited her to speak at events, schools asked her to mentor young girls, and a local newspaper even ran a feature on her journey from hardship to hope. One day, as Rachel was walking Eli home from school, she received a call that would mark yet another unexpected twist in her life. It was Sarah, the community director, calling with exciting news. The organization had recently received a significant grant to expand their programs, and they wanted Rachel to take on a leadership role as the director of the new branch focused on family outreach and empowerment. It was a salaried position, full-time, and it offered benefits that Rachel could only have dreamed of back when she was working odd jobs just to keep food on the table. She was stunned, her heart pounding with disbelief and gratitude. Here was an opportunity not only to provide for Eli, but to build a stable, secure future, a future where they would never have to worry about cold nights or empty cupboards again. With Eli's enthusiastic support, Rachel accepted the position. Her days became busier than ever as she threw herself into her new role with all the dedication and passion she could muster. She oversaw new programs, organized events, and expanded outreach efforts, working tirelessly to ensure that other families would have the resources and support that had been so scarce in her own darkest moments. Under her guidance, the organization thrived, reaching more people than ever before and transforming countless lives. Rachel became a pillar of the community, her story an inspiration that resonated with people far beyond Brook Haven. One summer evening, as the organization held its annual fundraising gala, Rachel was invited to share her story with the donors, supporters, and community members in attendance. Standing on the stage, looking out at the faces of the people who had supported her journey, she felt a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. She spoke about her life in Milwood, the hardships she had faced, and the strength she had found in herself to overcome them. She shared the lessons she had learned about resilience, compassion, and the importance of lifting others up. By the time she finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the event, people came up to thank her, shaking her hand and expressing their admiration. Among the crowd, she noticed Clara, who was beaming with pride, and Maria, who had recently landed a stable job and secured a home for her daughters. Seeing their faces, Rachel was overwhelmed with gratitude. She had come so far, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had found strength through her journey. That night, as she lay in bed, Rachel reflected on the path that had brought her here. She thought of Milwood, of the dark nights in the trailer with Eli, of Barrett's cold dismissal, and of the bitter struggle that had once seemed endless. And then she thought of Brook Haven, of the community that had welcomed her, the people who had supported her, and the life she had built from the ashes of her past. She realized that her journey had come full circle. Not only had she found freedom from her past, but she had also turned her pain into a source of light and hope for others. As she drifted off to sleep, a profound peace settled over her. Rachel had faced the worst that life could throw at her, and she had not only survived but thrived. She had found her purpose, a purpose rooted not in bitterness or vengeance, but in compassion, resilience, and the belief that every person, no matter their past, deserved a chance to rise. And as she dreamed that night, she knew that she and Eli were finally, truly home. Rachel's life in Brook Haven had blossomed beyond anything she could have dreamed. The once frightened, desperate mother, haunted by the memories of Milwood, had become a symbol of hope and resilience for the entire community. As she stepped fully into her role as the director of the Family Outreach Program, she poured her heart and soul into every project, every event, and every person who walked through the doors seeking help. The program's reach extended beyond Brook Haven, inspiring nearby towns to establish similar initiatives, and Rachel found herself regularly invited to speak at conferences and community gatherings across the county. Her story had grown into a beacon, a living testament to the power of overcoming hardship and choosing kindness over bitterness. As the years went on, Rachel's life settled into a rhythm that felt almost dreamlike in its stability. She and Eli had moved into a cozy house with a small garden, where they spent afternoons planting flowers and vegetables, something Rachel had never thought she'd be able to do. She relished the little moments, watching Eli run home from school with his backpack swinging, hearing him laugh as they baked cookies together, and knowing that each day was built on the foundation of her hard work and perseverance. Eli, now a thriving, curious boy with a passion for drawing, had grown up with a mother who had shown him what it meant to fight for a better life. He was deeply proud of her, often telling his friends about his supermom, who helped people find homes and jobs, and gave second chances to those who had nowhere else to turn. One brisk autumn afternoon, as Rachel was organizing files in her office, Sarah, the community director who had first brought her into the organization, entered with a look of excitement on her face. "Rachel," she began, barely able to contain her enthusiasm, "you have a visitor. Someone from Milwood. She says you knew her. Mrs. Dawes." Rachel's heart skipped a beat at the name. Mrs. Dawes, the elderly woman who had shown her kindness when no one else in Milwood had dared. Mrs. Dawes had offered her the old trailer on the outskirts of town, allowing her and Eli a small refuge during their darkest days. Memories flooded back, and Rachel felt a rush of warmth and gratitude. She quickly put her work aside and walked out to the lobby, where a frail yet familiar figure waited, clutching a walking stick and looking around with wide, curious eyes. "Mrs. Dawes," Rachel called, her voice filled with joy. The elderly woman turned, her face breaking into a broad smile as she recognized Rachel. "Rachel, my dear, look at you," she said, her voice soft but filled with admiration. "You've grown so strong, just like I always knew you would." The two women embraced, and Rachel could feel the years between them melt away. It was as if they had been transported back to that cold winter night in Milwood when Mrs. Dawes had given her a place to stay, a glimmer of hope in a world that had seemed devoid of kindness. They spent the afternoon reminiscing, sharing stories of how far they had both come since those days in Milwood. Rachel was struck by how much Mrs. Dawes had changed, yet her warmth and compassion remained undiminished. As they talked, Mrs. Dawes shared her own story of leaving Milwood not long after Rachel had left, seeking the new life away from Barrett's oppressive control. She had eventually settled in a small town not far from Brook Haven, where she had found a quiet, peaceful life. Learning that Rachel had found her way here and had become a pillar of the community brought Mrs. Dawes immense pride and joy. Rachel felt an overwhelming gratitude as they sat together, and she realized how much Mrs. Dawes's act of kindness had impacted her journey. She expressed her thanks, her voice filled with emotion as she spoke of how that small act of generosity had given her the strength to keep going. Mrs. Dawes smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Sometimes," she said softly, "all it takes is one small light to guide someone out of the darkness. I knew you were strong, Rachel. You just needed someone to remind you of that." After Mrs. Dawes left, Rachel returned to her work with a renewed sense of purpose. She wanted to be that small light for others, to pass on the kindness that had helped her survive. Her program expanded even further, offering scholarships for single mothers to pursue job training and education. She developed a network of partnerships with local businesses, creating job opportunities and safe housing for families in crisis. Each step forward was a way of honoring the people who had supported her, a tribute to the resilience of every person who had ever faced hardship. Then, one summer evening, Rachel received a letter that would once again connect her to the town of Milwood and her past in ways she hadn't expected. The letter was from a lawyer representing the estate of Arthur Barrett. Rachel's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, uncertain what to expect. Inside, she found a brief, formal note explaining that Barrett had passed away and, in a surprising final gesture, had left her a portion of his remaining assets. The sum was modest, diminished by the debts he had accrued before his fall, but it was enough to make a meaningful impact on her program. Rachel sat in stunned silence, reading the words over and over. Barrett, the man who had once shown her nothing but cruelty, had left her something in his will. It was a gesture she never could have anticipated, a strange twist in the story that had defined so much of her past. She pondered the meaning behind his decision, wondering if, in his final days, he had sought a form of redemption, or perhaps a way to acknowledge the wrongs he had committed. Whatever his reasons, Rachel found herself feeling a quiet sense of closure, a final piece of the past falling into place. Determined to turn this unexpected inheritance into something positive, Rachel made the decision to create a scholarship fund in Barrett's name, aimed at supporting families at risk of eviction. The irony was not lost on her, yet she felt it was the right choice, a way of transforming the pain of her past into hope for others. She shared her decision with her colleagues, who were moved by her choice to turn what had once been a source of suffering into a legacy of compassion. The scholarship fund became a pillar of the program, helping countless families avoid the devastating impact of homelessness and providing a path to stability and security. Years passed, and Rachel's life continued to flourish. Eli grew into a thoughtful, compassionate young man, deeply influenced by his mother's journey. Inspired by her work, he pursued a degree in social work, dedicating his career to helping others just as she had. Watching him grow into a kind, empathetic adult filled Rachel with pride beyond measure. He often spoke of his childhood memories, the nights they had spent in the trailer, huddled together for warmth, and the unwavering strength he had seen in her. To him, she was a hero, and he carried her story with him, a reminder of resilience and hope. Rachel's work expanded even further, her influence reaching beyond Brook Haven and inspiring communities across the region to adopt similar programs. She became a sought-after speaker, sharing her story at conferences and community gatherings, each time emphasizing the importance of compassion, resilience, and the power of lifting others up. Her life had transformed from one of survival to one of purpose, and she cherished each day as a gift. One evening, as she stood in her garden watching the sun dip below the horizon, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the countless faces she had encountered, the lives she had touched, and the legacy she had built from the ashes of her past. She remembered the young mother she had once been, lost and desperate, clinging to hope with everything she had. And she realized that every hardship, every struggle, and every act of kindness had shaped her into the woman she was today. As the stars began to dot the sky, Rachel felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had come full circle, transforming the pain and challenges of her past into a life filled with meaning and love. Her journey had not only changed her, but had touched the lives of countless others, a testament to the power of resilience and the strength of the human spirit. And as she stood there, basking in the quiet beauty of the evening, she knew that her story would continue to live on, not only through the lives she had touched, but through the legacy of hope she had created, a legacy that would inspire others for generations to come.